Thanks very much, everyone. Ms. McEntee and I have spent the last 2 days here in Brussels at the European Council meeting. Used the opportunity as well to have a number of other meetings, attended the EPP summit beforehand, met with Prime Minister May just to discuss the situation with regard to the attack in Salisbury, Northern Ireland, also Brexit as well. Had a bilateral with Prime Minister Rutte of the Netherlands discussing tax, EMU, and also Brexit as well as that. Had a side meeting with President Juncker, and he's accepted an invitation to visit Ireland, and we hope he'll do that in the next quarter. And as well, once again passed on Ireland's concerns in relation to the proposed EU-Mercosur trade agreement, a trade agreement which we favour, but one that we've particular concerns about with respect to beef and the beef industry. Also the chance to welcome the new Slovakian Prime Minister, Prime Minister Pellegrini, who joined us briefly yesterday but had to return home early in order to form a cabinet. The meeting started with a focus on economy and trade, and I'm very pleased that the conclusions were strengthened to include a strong commitment to proceed with legislative measures related to completing the digital single market. And that's something that Ireland is very much in favour of. We're a tech country, a digital country, and we think we have a lot to gain from the completion and deepening of the digital single market. We also had a discussion about the single market, which, as you know, is 25 years old now, but doesn't perhaps always function as well as it might. So the Commission has been tasked with developing by the end of the year a report on the state of play of the single market and how it can be completed and made to function as well as possible. There was a discussion on trade, both last night, but that continued this morning because we were awaiting signals from Washington DC, and that related primarily to the US tariffs on steel and aluminium. Ireland doesn't produce steel, but we do produce about 30% of the aluminium in the EU. Very little of that is traded with the US, but obviously these things do impact on the market for aluminium. We are pleased that the White House has decided to defer the imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminium until May, and there'll be a dialogue between now and then. But it's very much our view as Europe that such tariffs are not justified and are not acceptable, and we want there to be an exemption for the European Union. Last night over dinner it was mainly a discussion on foreign policy and external affairs. We discussed the chemical attack in Salisbury in England. That discussion went on for about 3 to 4 hours last night over dinner. We concluded as Europe that we were in full solidarity with the United Kingdom, that we agreed with their assessment that it was highly likely that Russian authorities were behind the attack. Decided as well that the European Union's ambassador to Russia would be recalled to Brussels for consultations, and also that a number of individual countries would take action next week. So a number of countries have decided next week to expel or withdraw diplomats. It's up to each individual country to decide what they're going to do. So our assessment in relation to that is underway. We'll make a decision on that next week. Also on Turkey, solidarity and support for Greece and Cyprus was agreed, particularly with respect to the Greek soldier two Greek soldiers who were detained in Turkey, and also the right of Cyprus to explore and exploit its own natural resources in its territorial waters. So I think there was a big focus in this council on external relations, and it was one of those occasions on which you really get the sense of how important the European Union is. 28 member states, all countries with populations of less than 80 million, yet countries surrounded by very big neighbours such as Turkey, such as Russia, such as the United States, and we have issues obviously of concern with all of those countries at the moment, ranging from trade to security. Article 50 format discussion occurred today, and that was on Brexit, and that obviously occurs without Prime Minister May present. Received a report from Michel Barnier on the progress to date, particularly with regard to the withdrawal agreement. As you all know, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and it's not anticipated that the withdrawal agreement will be finalised until October. It'll go to the European Council at that point, and then to the European Parliament and UK Parliament for ratification. However, between now and October, certain sections can be agreed in principle, and the transition section is now agreed in principle. That's a positive. It's very important for Irish business, for Irish jobs, for Irish agriculture that we have a transition period so that business, individuals, public services, farmers have an opportunity and time to adapt to any permanent changes that may take place from 2021. And the terms for that transition period are now agreed. It'll run until the 31st of December 2020. And during that period, even though the United Kingdom will not be a member of the EU, it'll still be bound by the rules of the single market, the customs union, the ECJ, even though it won't have any input into those decisions. But more important than that is the fact that it gives business, employers, employees, and the agri-food industry certainty in the period to the end of 2020. That, of course, is contingent, though, on the withdrawal agreement itself being finalised in October and then ratified thereafter. We're going to have discussions on the Irish Protocol next week. We now have full acceptance from the United Kingdom that there does need to be an Irish Protocol, a backstop as part of the withdrawal agreement, and there'll be discussions next week involving the task force and Irish officials on the one side, UK on the other. Those talks will happen in Brussels on the text of the Irish Protocol and any alternatives which the UK may put forward. And once again, Prime Minister May reiterated in words and in writing her commitment to the avoidance of a hard border and her full commitment to honour what was agreed last December. We also had an initial discussion on the future relationship that will exist between the UK and the EU after the transition period and adopted guidelines in that regard. Needless to say, this is going to be a very long process. What's intended, or at least what's aimed for, is that also by October we'll have a political agreement which outlines what the new relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU will look like after the transition period ends. That'll be kicking in from 2021, and that will be as detailed as is possible. But the actual negotiation of that treaty, that new treaty between the EU and the UK, will happen during the transition period. So Brexit's going to be a very long process, needless to say. It's going to go on for quite a number of years. When it comes to the Eurozone summit, that happened this morning, and that involved the heads of state and government from countries, the 18 countries that are members of the Eurozone. Also, Mario Draghi joined us from the European Central Bank. President Juncker, President Tusk, and the Portuguese finance minister, president of the Eurogroup, joined us as well. And we're going to have another Eurozone summit in June. No conclusions were made. It's just an opportunity really to exchange views. And the views that Ireland put across in relation to the deepening and strengthening of the Eurozone were fivefold. First, that we believe that we should be inclusive, that non-Euro countries that haven't joined the Euro yet, should be included in any, or should be allowed to opt in at least to any new EMU measures, also on the basis that many of these countries may join the Euro in the future. We're very much of the view that the best way to strengthen the Euro is actually national policies, countries balancing their budgets, countries reducing their debt, countries improving their own competitiveness, and that's the most effective thing and should not be substituted by European action. We need to do that as well. We expressed our broad support for developing the ESM into a European Monetary Fund, but that would happen on an intergovernmental basis and will continue to be covered by unanimity. And we've also expressed our view that we'd like to see banking union prioritised, and that would allow us to guarantee deposits across the Eurozone, and we'd like to see that agreed and concluded if possible at the summit in December. And we expressed our view as well that the multi-annual financial framework should be pro-growth, should be one that promotes growth across the Eurozone, with particular budget lines for things like research, development, horizon, education, all those fields that contribute to further economic growth, structural funds as well. I think one thing I forgot to mention was on digital taxation. There was a discussion on that yesterday. I think it's fair to say that there were very mixed views. Some countries very much in favour of the European Union pressing ahead and imposing a digital tax. A lot of other countries expressing a lot of reservations and raising a lot of questions as to how it would work. Again, no conclusions were reached on that, except that we would come back again in June and have a further discussion on the Commission proposals and take it from there. So happy. Do you want to come in there?
No, that's it. Okay.
Okay, Tony Connolly, RSD.
Taoiseach, on your announcement this morning about a security assessment on Russian diplomats in Ireland, before this all escalated, was there any prevailing information or assessment that the Irish government had on activity connected to the Russian embassy, or any wider concerns about cyber attacks and so on? And is it possible that an assessment could be made next week and no action taken, or how do you see it actually materialising?
Yeah, well, what was agreed, as I mentioned earlier last night, we all agreed as a European Union to express solidarity with the United Kingdom on the attack that occurred in Salisbury. It's our view that extraterritorial assassinations, the use of chemical weapons, is to be condemned no matter where it happens, no matter who perpetrates it. And we also agreed as a European Union that we share the UK's assessment that Russian authorities were involved in this, and we agreed that the EU would withdraw its ambassador from Moscow for consultations. Different countries are going to take different actions in the next couple of weeks. A number of countries next week are going to expel diplomats or withdraw ambassadors. Each country will make that decision for themselves. We've now begun an assessment as to what Ireland is going to do in response to that. We haven't made a decision on that yet, but that assessment is now underway. It obviously involves the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Justice, and my department as well.
But was there anything pre-existing that had given cause for concern?
You'll be aware these things are matters of national security, so it's I'm limited in what I can say about that. But anything we do in terms of further actions that we take as Ireland will be in response to what happened in Salisbury, not anything particular to Ireland.
Shauna Murray, Irish Independent.
Taoiseach, can you just give us some details about what you're expected to do in relation to the Russian inspection? Also, the Russian ambassador to Ireland has said that the move by Ireland is seen as something unfriendly, particularly seeing as there's no necessary results of investigation from the OPCW and essentially and then also just in relation to the to next week's discussions on the future framework, can you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, well, as Prime Minister May pointed out last night, the only role of the OPCW is to determine what agent was used, as in what chemical agent was used. The OPCW doesn't have any role in determining who did it. So I've heard some people suggesting that we should wait for a report from the OPCW. That doesn't help us come to any decisions, because all they will do is determine and confirm what agent was used, but not who was behind it. So essentially, the conclusion that we came to as 28 member states last night was based on the UK assessment of what happened, and also the fact that that was supported by other large countries that have their own intelligence services as well. In relation to next week,
The Russian ambassador to Ireland had said that the move by Ireland to, I suppose, agree this statement last night and consider, expelling some diplomats was deemed unfriendly towards Russia.
yeah, I don't think anyone should be surprised that Ireland should wish to stand by its allies. We're part of a European Union. That European Union has 28 member states in it, and other member states are sometimes subject to attack. We see a terrible attack today in France, in Carcassonne. The details of that are still coming through, but President Macron was able to brief us on that today, and I extended the condolences of the Irish people and the Irish government to President Macron on that. And last week, a attempted assassination using a chemical agent occurred in England. So part of the European Union and part of European solidarity is the 28 of us standing together. So if an unfriendly act is perpetrated on one European country, other European countries will stand together and stand by our allies, and that is, I think, what we would expect for us, and it's what we will do for other EU countries as well. What's agreed in relation to the next steps on the withdrawal agreement is that there will be discussions here in Brussels. A number of meetings have been scheduled over the next week or so, and those meetings will happen in Brussels and will involve Ireland EU task force on one side, if you like, UK on the other, and among the things that will be discussed, obviously, is the Irish Protocol. The UK has agreed to engage on that text. and also obviously we're open to any alternative text that they may put forward.
Sam Caswell, Irish Times.
Just in relation to the potential actions over the Russian situation, does it weigh at all on your mind the fact that Ireland has a small diplomatic presence compared to other countries if there were to be retaliatory action by the Russians against Ireland and our diplomatic mission there? And secondly, just in relation to the negotiations around the future of the border, what would you like to hear from the British next week when their negotiators come to the table at official level to see what they're going to propose in relation to a future post-Brexit border?
Yeah, I suppose on the first part first, yes, of course we have to weigh that into consideration. We do have a relatively small diplomatic presence in Moscow, a number of diplomats and also a number of agencies. So yes, of course we have to take that into account, but we have to balance that with our absolute wish to demonstrate solidarity with the United Kingdom, our nearest neighbour, which has been subject to an attack which everyone in Europe resoundingly condemned last night. On the second part, what we've heard from the UK already, as I said, both in writing in the joint report in December, in Theresa May's letter to Donald Tusk this week, and also in what's been said verbally at council meetings, is that they absolutely stand by their commitment that there'll be no hard border on the island of Ireland, and no physical infrastructure along the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I suppose what I'd like to see from them next week in the discussions is real engagement. They've agreed to engage on the text that we've put on the table, so I'd like to see them engaging with that, essentially, either agreeing to it, although I think it's fair to say that they've decided that they're not going to agree to it, but if they can't agree to it, to at least put forward alternative options that achieve the same outcome, because we're all saying that we want to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, that we're determined to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, but we need to have a solution that is legal and operable, and we've put one on the table, and that is backed up not just by us, by the entire European Union, by the 27 states that are remaining. If that is not acceptable to the United Kingdom, the onus is on them now to come up with amendments to that text or alternatives that achieve what we all say we want to achieve, which is no hard border on the island of Ireland, and that needs to be legal and needs to be operable.
And just maybe
Just
to say on that, I think as well it's important today to welcome the fact that Donald Tusk has reiterated that if it is not clear by the June Council meeting that a solution is going to be found, then obviously there will be issues raised at the June Council meeting. But in response to Theresa May's confirmation that the issues that were addressed in the Irish protocol will be addressed, obviously I think the fact that his recommitment for the July Council meeting is obviously something that we very much welcome.
Taoiseach, could you give us a bit more of a sense of the discussion last night on Russia? What were the arguments of some of the sceptics in the room that you heard? And was there a suggestion by others to take harsher measures beyond those discussed against Russia? Was, for instance, further boycotts of the World Cup suggested by any other members of the Council?
I suppose I'm loath to speak on behalf of other member states. I won't particularly say what any other member state said. I think I'll leave it to them to explain their own positions. There certainly wasn't any. There was no serious suggestion anyway about people boycotting the World Cup. But it obviously would be evident to all of us around the table that some countries qualified and others didn't, so it would have different impacts on different countries. In terms of the kind of things that were considered, there's talk of, for example, changing the Russian sanction rollover from a 6-monthly rollover to a 12-monthly rollover. There was a discussion perhaps of extending, I forget the name of the list, the Korgovsky list that was called? Magnitsky list, yeah. There's suggestions around extending that list to more people, and then when it came to the individual action by member states, there were some member states very keen that we should all act together, that we should all take the view that we would recall our expelled diplomats on Monday or Tuesday and do it together as the European Union. But as others pointed out, and understandably pointed out, that different countries have different constitutional positions. So whereas the President of France can make that decision on the spot, the Chancellor of Germany needs to talk to her coalition partners. Other countries are in the process currently of forming a government, for example, in Slovakia. So it wouldn't be possible for every country to do that at the same time on the same day. So some countries will do that early next week, and we are now assessing for ourselves as to what we can do and will do.
Jane
see it developing, or leading towards a new Cold War? And also this morning you said that yourself and President Macron sort of led the charge in firming up the language towards Russia. You've recently also talked about Ireland being the link between the EU and the US. So I was just wondering if you, is it your ambition to make Ireland more of an influence on the world stage?
I think it's the ambition of any Taoiseach to make Ireland more present and stronger on the world stage. It certainly is. That certainly is my ambition, but it's separate to this issue. Obviously, our aim to do that is very much outlined in the kind of things that we're doing, such as doubling our global footprint, for example, between now and 2025, increasing our international development aid budget, those type of things. It's not going to be about this particular issue that's in the headlines today. That's more of general policy. Sorry, I've forgotten your first question.
How do you see the Russia situation developing?
It's impossible to know. I'd be wise not to speculate on that. We'll see how it does develop in the coming days.
Do you hear Macron Irish example?
Taoiseach, just on the Russia issue, can I ask you, as part of the assessment next week, will you also look not just at the diplomats in the country, but the issues of maybe cyber security or the travel of those diplomats as well in the review? And just going back to the border question, there are some concerns that maybe there's a lot of vagueness there now, and this issue is being kicked down the road, and Ireland will not be a priority in negotiations ahead. Do you have a bottom line or a target you want that must be met in June or in October? Well, obviously October will be the last period, but by June anyway, the very minimum.
Well, the review is on the Russian diplomats. The review is now underway, and that involves obviously a meeting with the Russian ambassador and the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and it also involves consultations involving my department, the Department of Foreign Affairs, and also Department of Justice and the Gardaí. So that's ongoing now, and we've been in a position to make a decision next week as to how we're going to proceed. On the other question, obviously it's our objective and our aim to have the Irish protocol, if you like, agreed. You'll know the way that in June you'll know the way the withdrawal agreement is now working. There are parts in green, parts in white, parts in yellow. We'd certainly like to see most or all of that in green by June, and that is very much our objective. But the deadline for the withdrawal agreement is and always has been October of this year. And even though things such as the transition period are now agreed, or at least the terms are now agreed, nothing is absolutely agreed until October, and we're all very firmly of that position. So I know some people may think that the United Kingdom has banked that transition period. It is the case, though, that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and that can really only happen in October. But bear in mind, as Ireland, we wanted that transition period too, and the transition period is essential for Irish business, for Irish jobs, for the agri-food sector as well.
Catherine Fury?
Taoiseach, can I ask you about the digital tax? Catherine Fury. You've recognised that there needs to be a fair tax system for digital companies. And what the Commission has proposed is an interim measure until there's a global solution. And it's also a very modest proposal in that it's just 3% tax. The G5 have welcomed this, even the UK have welcomed it. Can I ask you, why is Ireland not welcoming it if you recognise that there is this need? And what does it mean what would be the impact of the proposal as it stands on Irish businesses, including the non-digital? What do you estimate would be the overall impact on your economy? And finally, when you're saying you've received support from other heads of government, should we round up the usual suspects, that Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and these are also countries that are known for weakening the tax base of their fellow European countries. Again, by not supporting this proposal, you are not showing solidarity with your fellow European countries. Do you think this is a sustainable position?
I think any interim measure has to be a good measure. I don't know if you've ever seen that famous episode of Yes Minister. It could be Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister, and Jim Hacker is there with Sir Humphrey, and Hacker says, something must be done. And the conclusion at the end of the discussion is, here's something, so let's do it. I don't think that's good policy. If you're going to do something, if it's going to be an interim measure, it ought to be something that works and is a good idea and is workable. And you mentioned the G5 there. I think the OECD report that came out this week is very instructive in many ways. And the head of the OECD said that this is too important an issue to rush. And that would be very much the perspective that we're coming from. So if you are going to introduce a new measure, it would want to be one that's rational and one that makes sense. And bear in mind, we've only seen this Commission proposal in the last couple of days, so we'll need to consider it properly. But the kind of things that occurred to us, and not just Ireland, other countries are raising these issues as well, is that we don't want to be seen to be taxing innovation, for example. Taxing an innovative digital sector. We don't want to potentially provoke a further conflict with the United States because the companies that would be most affected are US companies, and if we're going to do that, we'd want to think it through and think through what the consequences might be. There's also other countries that raised a particular concern about whether this proposal was actually contrary to the single market, because the whole idea of the single market is that companies, if they exist in any one country in the single market, can operate in all countries in the single market. And if you read the Commission proposal in a certain way, you'd almost be saying that every company would have to designate a virtual centre in different countries, and that goes against the principles of the single market. We also had concerns, and again, not just us, lots of other countries, around the whole concept of having a turnover tax in this way. And it wasn't just the usual suspects, by the way, who had a concern about a turnover tax, because most of us understand how the tax system works. You tax labour through income taxes, you tax sales through things like excise and VAT, and you tax profits where value is created. This is something very different, and what seems to be there in the Commission proposal is that you would tax the profits where the sales occur, and that would be quite a major departure in tax policy. So, for example, and I gave this as an example, Ireland as a country doesn't manufacture aircraft, but we do buy a lot of aircraft. Ryanair is one of the biggest buyers of aircraft in Europe, and we've a huge aviation leasing industry that leases and buys aircraft. So if we were to adopt this kind of principle, a turnover tax, for example, on aircraft, you would see profits that, the things that fall now as profit taxes on Airbus, for example, or Boeing, falling as a levy somewhere else instead. So it's quite a major departure from how you tax profits. And one of the other issues that was raised again by another country is the whole concept of where is value actually created when it comes to the digital economy. And that's one of the dilemmas that in the OECD report they say has to be fleshed out as well. In a digital economy, is the value created where the company is based, where the user uses the service, or is it something in between? And I think those things need to be figured out properly.
John Downey?
Taoiseach, on Tuesday, the Minister for Foreign Affairs noted divergence in Fianna Fáil's attitude to Brexit in his contribution to the Dáil. Last night we saw a statement from Fianna Fáil picking on this issue about June or October in relation to resolving the border. Do you see, there was an element at least of cross-party approach to Brexit. Do you see that deteriorating? Do you regret it? Do you have any thoughts on the issue?
I suppose I say three things on that. I think anyone who's been following Brexit and following this closely will know that that the target date for concluding the withdrawal agreement has always been October, and that's been the case for a long time. We will be able to agree discrete elements of the withdrawal agreement as we go along, but nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And it also needs to be ratified, of course, by the European Parliament as well, by qualified majority at the European Council and by simple majority at the European Parliament. So October, November going to European Parliament has always been the final deadline. But obviously other things can be agreed in principle, or at least the terms agreed before that. In relation to the opposition, as I said in the Dáil on Wednesday, I think it was, I don't expect blind support from the opposition on any issue, and that includes European affairs and Northern Ireland affairs. And I'm open to any questions that they want to ask. So I'm not going to get upset if they don't offer unconditional support. I don't expect unconditional support from opposition parties. But I do think it's fair to say there has been a change in tone and a change in temperature in recent months coming from the opposition, particularly the main opposition party that has moved, I suppose, from more constructive opposition some months ago to opposing the government about everything, opposition for opposition's sake, in more recent months. And I think that probably reflects just the political cycle rather than anything to do with the substance of policy. But my focus as Taoiseach and the government's focus has to be on the substance and has to be on getting the right outcome for Ireland, and that's what it'll continue to be.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I know there are lots of other questions, but we'll have to leave it there today.
Thank you.